We find ourselves 1/3 of the way through the Sfira Sa'omer, and I don't know about you, but I always had a very difficult time connecting to the Sfira Sa'omer. And besides growing an awesome beard and saying a bracha every night after Mariv, I really had no practical application and no actual connection to the Sfira Sa'omer. And I think the reason for that is because most of us look at the Sfira as something that's Kabbalistic and that kind of goes way over our heads. But if you just look at it on more of a general and then more of a specific level, I think that we can develop mahalach or a certain way that we can make it practical and actually gain something from this Sfira Sa'omer. If you look at the prototype or the basis for the Sfira Sa'omer, we find that it was essentially the 49 days from the Exodus up until Matan Torah. And what that represents is the Exodus was pure chesed, Hashem lifting us out of the 49th level of Tumah up to the highest levels of Kedusha. But at the same time, we were totally undeserving of that chesed. And when the recipient is completely undeserving of something, yet he's lifted to a very high level, we call that an isarusa de la'ela in Chassidus, which means an arousal from above. So when you don't put in any effort, but you experience some intense inspiration, that's what we call an arusa de la'ela. And when Hashem gives you that, it's only to make you aware that that's a level that you're capable of reaching. But it's not actually anything practical that you've built on your own. So after you experience an arusa de la'ela, Hashem removes the inspiration, and He says, now it's time for you to build that on your own. And that's essentially what the Sfira Sa'omer was the first time it occurred. It was 49 days where Hashem said, okay, now you know the levels that you can reach, and now I want you to reach them on your own. And Chazal tell us that each one of these 49 days, the Jewish people went out of one level of Tumah and entered into the corresponding gate of Kedusha. And in these 49 days, we turned ourselves into proper vessels that could receive the Torah at Har Sinai. So essentially, this is the exact same process that the Jewish people on an individual level, us, go through every single year from Pesach until Shavuot. Now, how that connects to the Spheros, which are roughly translated as the emanations of Hashem or the attributes of Hashem, is that each day of the Sfira Sa'omer has a specific energy or quality which you can actually pull from that energy to work on yourself. Meaning if it's the quality of chesed, you can now have siyata d'shmaya in that week to work on chesed, where Hashem can actually help you perfect yourself in that area of chesed. So if we look at the first three Sfirot to get ourselves to Tiferet, which is the week we're in right now, the third week of the Sfira Sa'omer, we can understand what avoda is incumbent upon us during these 49 days. So if we look at chesed, as we mentioned, chesed is an act of unlimited giving. During the week of Chesed is obviously a time when we're supposed to work on giving, the ability to not withhold what you have, but to give it to others. And giving, on the one hand, can be a good thing. On the other hand, if it's giving too much, it becomes spoiling, and that can be a bad thing. So Chesed has a good side, and Chesed also can be taken too far. The second attribute we experience is Gevura, which means withholding. Withholding is essentially not withholding because of cruelty, chas v'shalom. Withholding that we experience during the Sfira Sa'omer is withholding in order to give. For example, when you give a child too much, you ultimately spoil him. So at some point you need to withhold from that child in order to help him become independent and to help him develop into a proper human being. So that is what we speak about when we talk about the attribute of Gevura. On the other hand, Gevura can also be taken to an extreme, in which case someone is withholding and becomes stingy and does not have the ability to give. And that could be Gevura taken in the wrong direction. Two examples of this are Avraham Avinu and Yitzchak. Avraham had two children. He had Yitzchak and Yishmael. Yishmael was essentially Chesed, the attribute of Chesed, which represented Avraham, taken in the wrong direction, which became Gili Arayos, which is Chesed is given in the wrong direction, it becomes illicit relations. Whereas in the next stage, we have Yitzchak, who had two children, which were Yaakov and Esav. Esav represents Gevura taken in the wrong direction. Gevura is the attribute of Yitzchak, which means strength or strictness or din or judgment. And when you take that in the wrong direction, it becomes Shvichas Damim, which is murder, which is what Esav represented. So we ultimately get to Yaakov, which represents this week of the Sfira Sa'omer, which we're in, which is the Mira of Tiferet. Tiferet represents a fusion or a harmony of Chesed and Gevura. Now there's two ways that two opposites can coexist. One is called compromise, and one is called harmony. What compromise is that each energy or each person gives a little bit and takes a little bit, but nobody gets to fully express what they actually want. For example, if we're haggling over a price, and I want $30, I want to give $30, and you want $50, and we compromise on $40, neither of us get what we want, but we kind of reach a middle ground where we both get to express ourselves a little bit. What harmony is where both opposites express themselves fully and perfectly, and at the same time they can coexist. So the best example I've ever heard of this was given by Rabbi Kiva Tatz, and it's the bracha of rain. Now, rain is a very interesting bracha that you can receive, because if rain is given too much, with only pure chesed, with no ability to withhold, it becomes a flood and it becomes destructive. At the same time, if there's only gvura, then there is no rain, and the rain is completely withheld. What you have is a drought and a resulting famine. Rain only becomes a bracha when it's given and then withheld at the exact right moment. Bracha in rain is manifest when it's given enough to satiate the land, but it stops when enough rain has been given. That is chesed and gevura coexisting perfectly in harmony, where the act of giving is fully expressed as a perfect giving. At the same time, the withholding is for the complete benefit of the recipient, and it's a perfect withholding, and yet the bracha is perfectly manifest. So how is any of this practical and relatable to our personal lives during this week of Tiferes, where we can work on ourselves? So I'll give you 3 relationships that you can hopefully apply to your own lives, that you can work on this midah of Tiferet. The first one is between a father and child, if you happen to have children. When a father gives with unbound chesed too much, his child becomes dependent and ultimately spoiled. At the same time, if a father is too much of a person of gevura and withholds too much, his child might feel neglected and unloved. The way that a father becomes a perfect father is when he knows exactly how much to give and how much to withhold in order to develop the child into someone that is independent, and at the same time feels loved that he's being given, but he's withheld so that he doesn't become spoiled. That's a father and a son relationship. On another level, you have giving tzedakah. When you give to a poor person, if you give with unbounded chesed and you only give and give to this person, they become dependent on you. And then they'll never learn how to stand on their own and get their own job and make their own money and eventually become a functioning member of society. If you withhold yourself from the person too much with the attribute of gevura, then they're going to never be able to stand on their own either. So the only way that you can give a perfect act of tzedakah, which Chazal tells is the perfect act of tzedakah, is when you give enough in order to enable the person to become independent. As the old saying goes, don't give a poor person a fish, rather give him a fishing rod and teach him how to fish. Because when you teach someone to become independent by giving them just enough, while withholding at the right moment in time, that person can now develop into becoming something independent, and the giving and the withholding become perfect. The last relationship where we can maybe apply this in our own lives is when you teach something to either a student or a friend, and when you're learning together, is if you spoon feed information, the person never learns to develop their own ideas and never develops into their own person. Whereas if you withhold information, you're not a teacher. The way that a perfect teacher is manifest is when he knows the exact amount of information to give and knows exactly when to stop giving that information, so that that person can now develop his own ideas, but at the same time he has the crutches on which to stand, that he can have that base of information in order to build from there. Hopefully, we can take these ideas and apply them to our own lives and learn how in this week of Tiferet, the 3rd week of the Sfiras HaOmer, we can learn how to give and at the same time withhold, and ultimately that can turn us into proper vessels to receive the Torah at Har Sinai on Shavuos.